that is very over-exaggerated.
Really a temporary pain, far from really heading into crisis.
If China really want to have a pretty high rate or speed of the GDP growth, nothing can stop us. But our main focus is the quality.
We need better integration and how to synergize the division of labor and division of peculiarities in different localities.
Consumption in services. Personally, I believe that will be even more sustainable.
I don't think this is going to really sort of have meaningful and material damages on China's export. Because China is so essential in the international global supply chain, it's very difficult for any countries to sort of cut China out.
Welcome to the Chat Lounge. I'm Tu Yun. Joining me to explore where China's economy is headed to, Dr. Yan Liang, Professor of Economics, Willamette University, the United States. Dr. Zhou Mi, a Senior Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, and Dr. Liu Baocheng, the Director of the Center for International Business Ethics, University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. It's great to have you all back on the show. So let's first take a look at where the Chinese economy currently stands. While China's GDP grew 4.7% in the first half of this year, growth slowed to 4.3% in the second quarter, from 5% in the first. So, Dr. Liu, what's your interpretation of that slowdown? Is the economy clearly losing momentum, or is growth still within a reasonable range?
I would say it is still manageable, but definitely it shows a clear sign of momentum loss, but it is far from really heading into crisis. I think the slowdown reflects several pressures that are really combined. One is the domestic demand remain rather lackluster, and the property correction is still weighing very heavily on the investment. Household confidence are not there yet, at least as expected by the government. And then some of the local governments are still ridden by heavy debt, so they need to earn time to shift the leverage of earning their revenue, which used to rely very heavily on the land concessions. I think more seriously would be the private sector investment is still rather weak, because that not only the contribution to the economic growth data, but rather to the employment issues. But on the other hand, the brighter side is also very impressive. Chinese export has really exceeded expectation, and particularly for the high-tech sector, there has been quite a rally in supporting the robust AI-related industries. In the end, I should say the foundation is still very strong given the far greater manufacturing capacity, but it's really a temporary pain in shifting the leverage for growth by taking care of both of those prospective high-tech industries, and also giving the right support also to the conventional industries.
Right. Dr. Liu mentioned the Chinese economy is far from crisis, but some Western media have argued the Chinese economy is in serious trouble, highlighting problems like a property crisis or local government debt mentioned by Dr. Liu just now. So, Dr. Liang, from your perspective, how close is such kind of assessment to the reality on the ground?
Well, I think that is very over-exaggerated.
Right.
And there is, I think, just probably ignorance of what, China's economy in terms of the overall picture, which I think is a structural transformation, the emergence of new industries, new tech to replace some of these traditional old sectors like real estate. So there is a transition pain, as Dr. Liu just mentioned. But I think the overall trajectory is still, structural upgrading and stability, stable growth. But I think that in addition to the kinds of sort of ignorance, but I think there's also specific, I would say, some intentions to talk down on Chinese economy in a way that would shape expectations, and so that would produce sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And so I think that's why you see so much negative narrative. So again, Chinese economy is really large, even it just grew at 4.5 or 5%. That is due just the additional growth is a middle-sized, middle-income country. So I think I would agree with Dr. Liu's, diagnosis. I do think that there are sectors that are slowing down, especially like the real estate sector, but partly that's because of these, a strategic pivot away from the real estate sector driven growth. So that is really within a, calibrated and calculated slowdown, then you're seeing, the new tech industries and emerging technologies are developing. And these are not just small parts of the economy or isolated oases anymore. I think it was reported recently by Reuters that the high-tech manufacturing, the advanced exports and digital economy now account for 40% of China's GDP growth. So they're more and more becoming the mainstay of the economy. And of course, there's also demand side, sort of weakness, which again, I think that also has to do with the real estate sector slowdown that, lower the confidence and also reduce certain, purchases like housing, appliances, automobiles, and so on and so forth. So definitely there's more, I think, room to grow when it comes to demand side. But again, it's far from a crisis scenario. I think it's not even, sort of a too slow growth. I think the growth is stable and we need to look at not just a quarter or a month or even a year. It's much more, I would say, helpful to think about both in terms of medium and long term, the structural transformation with some weakness in the demand side in the short term, which again has largely to do with some of these transitional disruptions.
Right. Both Dr. Liang and Dr. Liu mentioned this high-tech manufacturing as a bright spot of the Chinese economy. And also there is this export. Dr. Zhou, could you please explain or elaborate a little bit further on that aspect, export, or can you give us some numbers?
Well, I agree that if you're looking at the data of the China's GDP for the first half of the year, it is a little bit slower compared with the first quarter. But I will also want to, mention that when we're, set the goals of the GDP growth for this year, at the beginning of this year, it is a range from 4.5 to 5%. So it is a range, and we're still within the range. I think that is a little bit higher than expectations from the lower, expectation of this GDP growth for the whole year. So it's not a bad thing, as Ian just mentioned, that it's far from that. And one of my points, I always have that point, when we're trying to discuss about the GDP growth as one very important indicators for evaluate the performance of the economy. I think that if China is really want to have a pretty high rate or speed of the GDP growth, there's nothing, can stop us. But our main focus is not like just to look at the speed. We are really taking care about the quality. I think that is what the both professors have just mentioned about what China is able to provide new opportunities for the high-tech development or the development based on this high-tech knowledge. So the activities are really diversified in China. And I think that is not just from only certain part of China, like the coastal area of China, who benefited from the foreign trade, as you just mentioned about, I think it's about the integration of the markets in different parts of China and strengthening the abilities for certain areas, even like in Xizang. Maybe many people think that Xizang is a place where they have to depend on, some of the financial support, but now it's getting on a better and better performance on the GDP growth. So, that is really a reflection about China's abilities to adapt to the changeable world. We are trying to have a better and more sustainable development. So let's look at the trade. I think that trade is a very good performance compared with investments, the transactions. The trade is, performing quite well. It has been continually to grow for more than 10 months. I think that is not just happened this year. It is a reflection and also a reasonable reactions by our trading partners. When China is doing that, the policies, including we open our market, we lower our tariffs, we are sending the messages to share the China's great and very important market opportunities with our trading partners. We provide the forums or platforms like the CIIE, the China International Import Expo, to have these opportunities for people to come here to China. So I think that is important issues when we're looking at the performance of the GDP. It's actually are getting very strong momentums, and the import is even playing a more important role. The first 7 months of this year, the import growth is 5% higher than average. So I would say that the global trade or the international trade of China is really a reflection about the China's relations with our trading partners. The relations is becoming stronger. It's being strengthened. That is what I have noticed for the trade performance.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
So generally speaking, it seems you all agree that the fundamentals are still solid and there's not big concern there as far as the Chinese economy or its growth is concerned. But obviously, authorities do not want to continue down this road. I mean, losing momentum, right? So that's why it keeps rolling out policies to further bolster, if you will, the economy, right? So recently, the finance ministry says its priorities for the rest of the year are to speed up the use of fiscal funds, step up efforts to boost domestic demand, and strengthen the fiscal reform and management. So, Dr. Liu, what do these policy signals tell you about how policymakers view the current state of the economy, and why is the emphasis on both speeding up the implementation of existing policies and preparing additional measures? Does that suggest the economy, doesn't need large-scale stimulus, but does need some stronger policy support?
Yeah, I just came off a meeting with a number of policymakers,
Right.
and I would say that there's better diagnosis of the Chinese economic performance because it's generally understood as the strategically resilient but structurally divergent. So therefore, how to identify the economic cycles and what are those causes of the temporary slowdown, and then you need, based on the correct diagnosis, you can really have a better prescription that is targeted to certain problems. So now the finance ministry is acutely aware of the problems, particularly structural problems we are facing. And on one hand, they really want to show that they can have a type of a draconian way of dealing with proactive fiscal policy. On the other, they still want the right delivery of economic result. Therefore, how this money are going to be used, one, of course, is going to support the identified mega infrastructures by the government so that that can turn out to be a multiplier of economic growth or to shore up the certain local economy. And second, they wanted to stimulate domestic demand, which I really feel less confident about because it is not really the monetary terms or it's simply giving some coupons to solve the problem. It is really the stabilization of job opportunities, right expectation over the continuous income, and also relief of some of the financial burdens of the household, particularly in terms of social security belt. Third is really to support the high growth industries, particularly those high-tech ones, so that we can be more innovation-driven rather than the mass skill-driven. In the meanwhile, they also need to take into consideration that those high-tech sectors do not provide the desired employment level that people practically need. Although the unemployment figure is still manageable with 4.2, we have to pay attention to the Chinese unique structure where the urban unemployment is not really calculated in the government statistics. So particularly for those younger people who are really migrating from rural area, but they do not really enter into statistic figures. So that's something that we need to pay attention to. The other issue is that what would be the government efficiency? It is not really the money that's there, but it is really the work ethics, how to cut the red tapes, how to help the private sectors to solve certain problems in terms of the management, in terms of the marketplace, in terms of the contractual disputes, etc. So this is something that really requires a holistic approach. So to borrow from the future generation by issuing large long-term bond, yes, you can really make people happy and support big projects for a while, but that has to be a more calculated approach and targeted approach.
So you highlighted the government work ethics or its efficiency as the major.
Yeah, one is that government bureaucracy, long red tapes, the unpredictable timeline in approval. That's also the public ethics. The other is implementation. We have been very successful in climbing down on the corruption and also the settle dealings between the market versus the power circle. But there has been lazy approach, general complaint, and also whether subsidies are really being channeled to the desired projects. And more importantly, and more acutely, many local governments still owe a large amount of debt to some of the private contractors. So that also needs to be cleared so that the private sectors could really have confidence. I also interviewed a number of private sectors. They are really hesitant to get engaged into long-term contract, into government procurement program, because he said, okay, some local government, they acknowledge all the debt, but they are not really there ready to pay because of the financial constraints, etc. So all of this, market conditions need to be streamlined, which cannot really be replaced simply by offering more budgetary support to the local government.
Right. So you're saying that government efficiency or governance is one aspect that needs to be improved. Then, Dr. Liang, your take here. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, so I agree with Dr. Liu. I think as you started the question, it's about, the Ministry of Finance and what fiscal policy is going to move for the second half of the year. And I think that I largely agree. I think, yes, government efficiency is important, especially at the local level, because we know how local government is so important for Chinese economy, right? And also we know that local governments are responsible for about 85% of the fiscal spending. So local governments are essential. And I think one of the problems or one of the weaknesses in China right now, it's actually not as much of the low investment demand, because I think when you look at retail sales, it is still growing, especially service consumption is still growing. I think it's actually the fixed asset investments. When you look at the first 7 months of this year, it has declined by 6.7%. And of course, largely this is due to the real estate sector. But even for infrastructure, it has gone down by 6.7%. And compare that to the past 5-6 years or 10 years, the infrastructure growth, investment growth is usually between 5 and 6%. So there is a very salient slowdown. And I think part of this is, the local government financing is having some difficulties, right? Because of the real estate sector slowdown, the land sales revenues for local government has gone down by over 30% in the first half of this year. So that's also what, Dr. Liu talked about. The local governments are still owing to their contractors and suppliers and yet to, pay them. But I think it's a genuine sort of a difficulty, right? Because they're losing the revenues. For the first half of this year, the local government, their revenue only grew by 3% and the spending only grew by 0.6%. So it's a very small growth when it comes to fiscal spending at the local government level. So the central government is spending a lot more. The central government is spending over 6%. So that is very helpful to provide a sort of fiscal boost to the economy and also for certain infrastructure spending. We know that local governments are really essential in this infrastructure investment. So the local government's revenue slow down, their spending slow down, I think that becomes a drag on the economy. That's why I think the Ministry of Finance talked about the second half, the fiscal policy will need to be not necessarily double down, but at least, it needs to be more proactive, especially when it comes to the investments in the 6 networks. That's the major infrastructure in water, in electricity grid, in telecommunication, in computing powers, in logistics. So these are really important infrastructure because these are not just for the short-term stimulus. This is really to get China tech ready, AI ready, climate ready for the medium and longer term. So I think that's why it's important to talk about this fiscal policy not as a temporary fix stimulus, but really with the long-term strategic imperatives. And of course, as Dr. Liu also mentioned earlier, that the fiscal spending is not just this big ticket item investments, but also for social safety net and to support local businesses. So I think that's why we need to think about the fiscal policy in a more sort of proactive, but also constructive way, not just sort of as a short-term stimulus measure.
Then what do you think has been preventing local governments from or constrain them from doing so? Maybe their ability or maybe their willingness to do it more proactively?
Well, I think that, what I mentioned earlier is that their revenue at the local level has really declined because of the land sales has gone down. So that's why, the local government revenue has grown at a much slower rate than the central government. The central government in the first half of this year, their revenue grew at 9%. The local government's revenue grew at 1/3 of that. So only 3% growth in their revenues. So with limited revenue and with a lot of spending responsibilities, the local governments are really hesitant to, invest in infrastructure or any other spending. And the other thing is, as we know, that the local government is also very much debt-ridden. The central government debt to GDP ratio is around 25%. The local government, their budgeted on the book debt is around 35%. But there's a lot of, as we know, the local government hidden debt, right? These local government funding vehicles. That's why, again, the central government has been trying. They have already launched this 3-year, massive bond swap program worth 10 trillion yuan to help local governments to swap out the expensive LGFV debt with the more municipal bond issuance. So that will reduce their debt service burden and so on and so forth. So I think those are the major reasons what constrains local government, right? The revenue is slowing down in growth and they're having a large amount of debt. So those need to be worked out. And I think the central government has been doing, as I mentioned, the debt swap, but they're also providing 10 trillion yuan worth of fiscal transfers to the local government. They're also allowing for special bond issuance of around 2 trillion so far this year to help the local governments to fund their basic operations and so on and so forth. So I think there are measures being implemented to help the local governments to get their finance in order. And I think that is very helpful to implement proactive fiscal policy because local governments still really hold the key.
Right, but
the other issue is really it's too large government bureaucracy at the local level. Even at the content level, you may have more than 60 type of the government agencies. And so some of the local revenue, they cannot really cover even the salary of government officials. So that's one thing. The other is that the local competition between different local governments, because more than 60% of the Chinese third-tier cities, they are having a very homogeneous type of planning. Everyone is really there to invest into robots, into drones, etc. So we need better integration and how to synergize the division of labor and division of peculiarities in different localities. So that's something we need. And third, the central government is calling on to have a unified domestic marketplace, which means that we have to streamline, the standard, to streamline the judicial integration in solving contractual disputes, etc. So I think that's something need also substantial reform. So these are really the issues that we need to look at the picture in a more holistic type of approach instead of simply by issuing more money to them or getting engaged more of the monetary transfer to the local government. They have to do the right type of job and do it more precisely and, as Dr. Liang has mentioned, more constructively.
Or maybe it's because the limited channel for them to invest, right? Because it's the same, like in the States, people are swarming into this path of a high-tech investment. Maybe it's just because there was no better choice there, right? Yes, the central government instructed them to do so, just do it, but they need to shoulder responsibilities if things go wrong. So it seems they might be too prudent or cautious when they make decisions or make investment there. So what else can they do, right, Dr. Liu?
I think they need to really to have a global view in assessing the capacity building in their industrial clusters. Second, they need also to improve their local investment environment in which they really are there to effectively provide intellectual property protection and respect those local entrepreneurs. And also, they need to identify better of their competitive advantage in the local produce and how they can really get fitted into the entire supply chain instead of building a holistic type of cluster on themselves, which is less competitive. And need to also to look at the larger picture as how to standardize their operations so that they can get better fitted with other regions instead of engaging, managing their local kingdom. So these are really the issues. And of course, the central government also requires better coordination and better guidance in their industrial mapping and also managing their local advantages instead of getting engaged in a type of a homogeneous competition with the rest of the other regions. We're also doing a great job in terms of the Yangtze River Delta integration in the Greater Bay Area and also the Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei integration. We're already rolling out a larger picture, which has already shown very positive results yet. I think the whole country, and particularly local government, need to really reflect on the benefit of integration instead of engaging in managing a more of an isolated or capsulated type of operation on their own.
Or maybe it's because of the imbalanced capabilities of local authorities,
That's right. Yeah, it's more of their capacity in their vision and in their management capacity.
Right, but those policies or measures will take time to generate some fruit, but there's this one area that all local authorities or governments can focus on to generate imminent effect is the demand area, right? But authorities have introduced a range of measures. Those measures seem to haven't generated a stronger rebound in consumption. Why is that? We will find out the answer after the short break. This has been the Chat Lounge.
Do you have a story about China? We want to hear from you. Maybe China has become your second home. Maybe it has brought you new friendships, creative partnerships, or a new path in life. We are inviting people from the U.S. to share their real stories and experiences with China. No expertise needed, just your authentic voice. Your story could be featured in our Hello from the Other Shore podcast coming this September. Share your name, city, and story with us. Email us at radio@cgtn.com.
Welcome back to the Chat Lounge. We continue our chat on where China's economy is headed to. Authorities have introduced a range of measures ranging from consumer trading subsidies to interest subsidies, but those measures seem to haven't generated a stronger rebound in consumption. Dr. Zhou?
Well, so first of all, I would say that China's consumption is have a very large basis. So we're not just trying to have some incremental increase. That needs a lot of input. We need to give a lot of incentives for those perhaps some of these consumption behaviors. We need to encourage the consumers to try to buy something that maybe without this kind of incentive, they were not trying to make the decision. That is really need a large amount of money. And second, I think that, these kind of policies are not just brand new. It has been there for many years or even decades, more than a decade. So we know that in the economy, there is a marginal effect of a reducing impact on the possible policies. So it's gradually becoming less and less incentive to the consumers' decisions. I think that is also very important for many of these things. And third, I would say that the consumers, if they have inspired by those policies last year, they were not just replace new one based on some of these new policies or incentives. So they, all the consumption products are getting quite a lot of time to be used. Like some of it are endurable products. The people will need to refresh or update those products maybe after several years. So we cannot just try to expect that all these policies could be very effective to encourage the people to buy. But there are always some new things. Like personally, I bought a new watch. I think that watch is also a very good one with better performance and higher technology, and it will make it more sustainable for being used for more than 3 weeks. So when I found that this new version of the watches came into the market, I really tried to look for some of these policies, and I really found that. So all these factors put together, I decided to replace the old one with this new one. So the consumption of the products or consumption of these goods are limited on several quite important issues, especially when there are so many competitions already there. If you are going to have some impacts to encourage people to place an order, you need to persuade them that is worthwhile, and that will not just affect your life quality or the balance of your income and the expense, but also trying to give you a higher quality of life. So this is for the consumption in goods, but from last year, the government is trying to do more encouragement on this consumption in services. So I mean, that would be maybe the next emphasis of this government's policies on encouraging consumption. Personally, I believe that will be even more sustainable. The services cannot be stored. So the services can only be consumed at the same times when they are provided by the suppliers. So it means that you are not trying to store a lot of services at home and trying to enjoy those services gradually day after day. You need to consume that. So that is really our important differences compared with consumption of the goods. So if we're going to provide incentives to encourage the people to consume the services, that will be more sustainable. And another one is that China's service markets is far less developed compared with the goods market. So we still have a lot of room or space to encourage the suppliers and increase or improve the ecosystems or consumptions on the services. So that will be much more potential for us to do in the coming days. So the consumption is a very hard thing for the government to change. And I think it's not just in China, but also in many other countries. If the consumers decide not to consume, you have very few tools that you can change their minds. It maybe needs some time, especially when China is facing a lot of challenges like the aging problems, like also some of the impact from the automations that need us to try to improve the people's confidence on the future. Also need us to further strengthen our social welfare system to make the people feel less worried about the future, and they can be more concentrate on the daily lives and trying to have a better life that is also true for the rules of the market.
Right. Dr. Liang, in the States, do you have similar stimulus plans like to stimulate domestic consumption? Or from your perspective, how can Chinese authorities do, or what can they do to achieve the goal they actually intended?
Right. So I would say that for Chinese policy makers, they are always taking the longer term vision. I think that, has a lot to do with the political cycles and things like that, right? In the US, every 4 years you have a presidential election. So politics is usually, very short term oriented. And so that means the economic policies are also becoming very short term oriented. So if 1 year there is a GDP decline, then you wanted to stimulate it right away. You may take on more debt. It may be a short-term measure, but you would do it because, you are always in that election cycle. But I think for China, the political system is such that the policymakers are much more long-term oriented. They're not just thinking about 1 quarter, 1 month, or even 1 year's GDP growth rate. They're thinking much more in the longer term. So I think that reflects in the policymaking. It's not always only emphasizing on, counter-cyclical measures. You hear the term cross-cyclical measures. So I think that's why there's a difference, right? It's not just a rush to have a bazooka kind of stimulus to pop up the economy in the short term, but really, what kind of measures would make sense both in the short term and in the long term. So I think that is a major difference. If I may, I also wanted to go back to the 2 important points my panelists shared.
Sure.
So for one, I think, when it comes to local government redundancy, I agree it is a problem. But we also need to be thinking about, in the past, because of this fierce competition amongst, the local economies, that's why we're also getting, a lot of these very quick technological innovations, very quick commercialization of innovations, and a lot of growth-oriented measures to support local economies. So in some ways, the media called it as a catfish effect. So when you have many, companies are competing, they are genuinely trying to, compete through innovations, and now, of course, some price wars. But I think we need to see it in a sort of balanced way. So I think balance is really important, right? So we need to make sure that, try to build this unified market on the one hand, encourage healthy competition amongst, local businesses, and provide guidance, right, to have the more localized specialty, as, Dr. Liu, I think, very rightly point out. So not all locations should do EVs or robots or whatever, right? That you have this kind of industrial clustering. I think it's very impressive that in China, you have this Yangtze River industrial clustering where, within 4 hours, you'll be able to pretty much obtain all the main components of an EV. And now in the product area, now within 1 hour, you can get almost all the parts and components for humanoid robots. So I think the kinds of localized coordination and specialization are really important. And I fully agree with what Dr. Liu said. And one last thing is I think maybe fiscal incentives also need to be changed. If local governments so much rely on, value-added tax to get their revenues, of course they would have wanted to, have more production in the localities, even though these may not really thrive. But there's, this tremendous incentives. And then, I think Dr. Zhou Mi mentioned about service consumption. I think that is definitely really a growth spot because you look at China's service consumption, it accounts for about 46% of the total consumption. When you look at the advanced economies, United States, for example, is 69 or 70%. And so I think, growing the service consumption is really important. Also, I think by the same token, expanding the service sector is so important for job creation, which again, I think I agree with Dr. Liu that job creation, income growth is really the essential driving force for consumption. So service sector is providing about 50% of jobs right now for China, and service sector creates about 80% of jobs for the US. So again, there is huge room to grow the service sector, provide quality jobs, That would really help with job and income growth. And one last point, if I may, I think it's also important to think about is many people, are hoping to have employment growth in manufacturing sector. But the matter of fact is that manufacturing sector job creation is slowing down, even in China, right? Even China is a manufacturing powerhouse. But I think, more and more jobs are going to be created in the service sector. So I think that is why, promoting both service consumption and service supply is essential.
So you're saying there's a big potential to explore there, and you do believe China can do that?
Yes, I think so. I think, again, I wanted to go back to, Dr. Liu talked about this, to promote consumption, you need to have income and jobs, you need to have confidence.
Right.
A lot of these, trading program, actually, I think the trading programs are quite effective. When you think about last year, the trading program in terms of the fiscal commitment is about 300 billion yuan. But it generated 2.6 trillion sales, especially in auto, in home appliances, and others. And so that ratio is, close 1 to 8, 1 to 9. So it's a pretty successful program. The problem is that, even if you have the trading subsidies, you still have to have the income to consume. And also for goods, once you buy enough cars, appliances, you're not going to keep buying them. So that's why you cannot reliably, enduringly rely on these direct sort of stimulus for consumption. You really need to still think about the more fundamentals, right? How you create jobs, create income, boost confidence. So I think that's why the Western media, point to China and say, the government is not stimulating consumption enough. But there's no shortcut. There's no direct stimulus that would work to, boost consumption overnight. So I think, again, the Chinese policymaker is more thinking about, how to enable people to spend, to provide incentives and the right type of products and scenarios to encourage spending.
But what you just mentioned takes time, or as we all know. But at the same time, pressure from outside seems to be mounting, apart from what we are facing inside this country. Yes, we do see exports were doing great in the first half. Foreign trade grew almost 17% in the first half of the year. But external pressure is apparently becoming greater, right? The U.S. is reportedly considering a new, like a 7.5% tariff on Chinese goods, saying what it calls Chinese overcapacity. And the European Union is also increasingly using its foreign subsidies regulation to scrutinize Chinese companies in such areas as acquisitions and public procurement. We've seen Brussels launching an in-depth FSR investigation into Chinese e-commerce giant JD.com's proposed acquisition of Germany's sea economy. So how could such kind of restrictions or constraints affect Chinese companies and even the wider Chinese economy, Dr. Zhou?
You mean the external factors?
Right.
Yeah, I think that there are some contradictory aspects of this question. The first one is that China committed to open wider. That means that we are going to be connected with the outside world in a better way, a more integrated way. So when we're trying to change some of this with these uncertainties, or we call it a risk, so we need to have this mechanism to try to monitor all these possible factors change, and we are trying to stabilize this environment in a better way. And on the other hand, I think that when we're becoming, more connected with the outside world, the world will benefit with more collaborations and also the same or similar efforts in dealing with the uncertainties. So, when we are facing the challenges coming from the Middle East, the world was afraid that China will import more crude oils, and there will be more competitions in acquiring more crude oils from the market, and the market price is going very high. But China is trying to stabilize these expectations by having a very strong supplies on other alternative energies and trying to make the market don't feel so hard on deciding the future of the supply. So this means that China is giving more confidence to our trading partners, no matter in the platforms of multilateral trade in the WTO or in the regional or bilateral trade agreements. We are giving more support to stabilize the expectation of the market. The external factors are important, but I think that the world is having more patience and willingly to hear more from China. What China is going to deal with these impacts, and how could China's action be, contribute to the stabilize of all these related impacts. I think that this is a way that China is dealing with the external uncertainties or factors that will distort or change the structure of the global supply chain.
But how much could those measures weigh on China's economic growth is the question, right? We're talking about how far or where the Chinese economy can go. So how much would those measures affect the Chinese economy? Has the Commerce Ministry had any estimation or calculation there?
I don't think that is a very simple question. It's so interacted by all these factors. So we cannot just change the other countries' decisions, but we can just try to manage our own. So, in the 15th five-year plan, one of the main attitudes or direction is we're trying to strengthen our domestic market, trying to have a better integrations on the different parts of the market and trying to have a better performance and abilities to deal with these uncertainties. So maybe it is true that some factors will affect China's market in certain degree, but I assume that this impact will be decreased on this possible hurt of China's economies in the coming years. And that's some of our expectations.
The Chat Lounge. The Chat Lounge unpacks views and opinions on hot issues in a more casual way.
Dr. Liang, what's your expectation or estimation?
Well, I would first say that a lot of this Western narrative about China squeeze or China shock, I think is really a deflection. China is competitive, and many countries, they have not, invest enough in their own industrial upgrading. They have not really tried to strengthen their industrial sector, but financialized. And that's mostly, their own kind of policy era. But then putting the blame on China and impose, tariff barriers, I think is really a deflection, and it's not going to be helpful for themselves. And then I think the impact on China, I don't think this is going to be really sort of have meaningful and material damages on China's exports, because for one, China's exports are now mostly increasingly are going towards the global south. So BRI countries now are way more important, over 60% of China's exports share, more important than the Western economies, the G7s. That's one point. And the second point is that when you look at some of the research, for example, by the Peterson Institute of International Economics, what they found is that even though the direct Chinese exports to the U.S. fell, and so China's share of the U.S. imports has fell about 13% in the past 2 years, but in terms of the value added share, only declined by about 2 to 3%. What that means is that because China is so essential in the international global supply chain, it's so integrated into the entire supply chain, it's very difficult for any countries to sort of cut China out from the supply chain. So what ended up happening is, for example, China's exports go to Vietnam or go to Mexico and have some local value added there and then re-export it to the United States. So in other words, even if you may cut China from your direct trade, you are still in that China-centered global supply chain system. So I don't think that, China's trade is going to be reduced because of these protective measures. Not to mention, I think, as China continues to upgrade its trade structure, more and more these tech products, you simply can't find replacements. Even more expensive versions, you may not be able even to get. Rare earths is another example, right? It's not that you are willing to pay more, you can get it from elsewhere. It's very difficult. So I don't think that's necessarily a big concern. But I think it is good for China's own benefits to boost domestic demand, because if China's residents, Chinese people, can consume better quality products and services, this is going to boost their own, standard of living. This is going to provide better well-being for the consumers. They should enjoy the fruits of their hard work. So that's why I think, keep boosting domestic demand, including consumption, and not to forget investment, and not to forget fiscal spending, because those are three internal demand, right? It's not just consumption. Mm-hmm. So to your point, if China wants to hedge this kind of external risks, then yes, boosting domestic demand, and that it's not just consumption, but investment and fiscal spending as well. But again, I think this Western narrative about cutting China out of the supply chain, cutting China from the trading system, I don't think this is a realistic scenario.
But I think, as we've all seen, they've done what they can, right? Have done their best to introduce all kinds of stimulus measures. But what else can we do?
Well, I think, again, in the short term, as we mentioned, right, the fiscal spending, it's helpful, and also targeted financial measures. So already the plan of 800 billion yuan structured finance that would help with high-tech sectors, small and medium-sized enterprises, and capital injections to, commercial banks. So fiscal and monetary and credit policies would all very helpful to boost China's investment demand and also, bolster the social safety net. So all of these would be helpful for investment and consumption boost. And of course, this, direct fiscal spending, that's again part of the domestic demand. So you have all three demand that still have the room to grow. And some of these would be immediate, others would take some time, as you mentioned. And then I think, again, export will continue to support China's growth. And finally, I think this whole structural transformation is going to continue. Some of these sort of new sectors used to be very small part of the economy. Now they're 18%. And now China is working on industrial robots, advanced pharmaceuticals and pharmaceutical equipments and other, advanced equipments. And China is making really a lot of progress in AI technologies. So all of this, I think, will continue to drive China's growth. And even if, short term, the growth may slow down, right? I mean, from the past 6-7% to now 4.5 to 5%, but that's still stable growth that I think will be helpful for China. Actually, I think the major challenges is, how to maintain stable employment because all the automations and also now a lot of, gig economies, 200 million, 300 million workers now in the gig economy. Maybe Dr. Liu has a higher number or whatnot. But I think that is really how do you keep the decent jobs and income growth, not just, GDP growth? I think that actually deserve more policy measures and policy attention.
Yeah, like you mentioned, fiscal spending is one of the key measures that you can use. When we come back to fiscal spending, what support do you think the authority should take? Or is it focusing on faster deployment of special and ultra-long special treasury bonds? Or further assistance for property sector, local governments, and private businesses? What specifics would you say?
Well, on the financing side, yes, I think special purpose bonds will be helpful to finance a lot of these fiscal investments, especially in infrastructure and also when it comes to real estate sector. But in terms of the directions or the areas of fiscal stimulus, I would say, yes, the real estate sector could use some help. And what specifically I would, suggest is really the social housing projects. Because right now, I think the main problem in the real estate sector is you have all these housing that are built but not utilized. And so that's a waste of real resources.
Right.
And local governments are hesitant to subscribe to these social housing projects because, again, it's not necessarily financially sound for them. A lot of these locations, the rent yield ratio is lower than the borrowing cost. So the local governments don't necessarily want to do that. So that means the central government need to take on more of the financing burden to implement the social housing program. So if you are able to, destock in these assets housing, that would help to stabilize the housing market. And you could also develop the rental market, which I think is a policy initiative. And in addition to that, I think I mentioned earlier the 6 networks, the infrastructure that is part of the fiscal spending on investments. And then finally, I would say service sector. This is, again, going back to what we talked about. The service sector needs some policy measure to expand. Because again, if you look at, for example, the data from January to July this year, the fixed asset investment in education sector, negative 15% growth. In health and social services, 13% decline. Cultural, sports, and entertainment, 13% decline. I'm reading these numbers from the National Statistics Bureau because I know for the fact that, the investments in the service sector has been declining, even outside the real estate, right? But then at the same time, we said we wanted to boost service consumption. But how can you not invest in education or health or culture, but then at the same time, you want to boost consumption of those services, right? So I think that's why there could be more investments in the service sector. That's where the direction should be.
Thanks for that. And last question to you all. If we look 2 to 3 years ahead, what's the most important transformation China's economy needs to complete? And if the transitions go well, what could China's next growth model actually look like? As we say, the Chinese economy is going through a shift. Shall we begin with Dr. Zhou, please?
Okay, in my understanding, I think that the ideal model maybe will be still dominated by the abilities of manufacturing. But this manufacturing is mainly supported by the intelligent manufacturing and with a lot of support on the services. So this development and the transformations of these abilities of economies could be also accompanied by the talents, skills, and capabilities. So we will have quite important roles in the global supply chains on those intelligent products, green products. And I would say that would be the way for us to have a sustainable development and at the same time to meet the demand of the world in a better way.
All right. Dr. Liu?
I would say On the industrial side, there will be more transformation from labor-driven type of operation, more into capital and also technology-driven economy. And on the consumption side, it's more of the respect to the individual decision-making with a deeper pocket rather than simply short-term stimulus packages to boost their consumption. And the government will be more focusing on providing the public goods, which is not really achievable by private investment, by, for example, by ensuring food quality, by providing better environmental control, by providing adequate and also fair justice over certain disputes. So over Chinese export, I think there will be more added value and also more of the investment driven. And then lastly, on the global rules, I think there will be more adaptation, and also hopefully China can also contribute to the rulemaking on a more transparent and just way to contribute to the global rulemaking process.
Yeah, it's not we don't want to contribute. It's someone else wouldn't let us do it. Well, last but
you have to grow your own capability and communication and persuasion.
Sure. And last but not least, Dr. Liang, please help us wrap this up.
Well, I largely agree with what my two colleagues have just mentioned. I do think that if the question that you have is, what China needs to work on, or, what would be the trajectory, I do think that, that this AI Plus initiative, right, to not only develop high tech, but really integrate the high tech into the broader economy, right, advanced manufacturing to services, to public governance, to people's well-being. I think that is a great way to boost productivity and really commercialize this technological development to cultivate the, productive forces, the high quality productive forces, and to promote productivity growth. And on the demand side, I do think that, job creations, it's really important. So again, try to expand service sector and service sector jobs, but importantly also to really provide regulations and policies to support high quality job creation, so good jobs. So I think there has been in the past, right, policies to, for example, for food delivery and some other sectors, like ride sharing, to make sure that the workers' rights and the treatments are ensured, so then these workers can get good jobs and have income growth to support their consumption spending, and also reform the income policies and I would say the fiscal policy as well to ensure better distribution of income and redistribution, and provide the social safety net, and all of those I think are important for consumption demand. And then of course, as we mentioned throughout, investment growth, especially in these new generations of infrastructure and continuous tech developments, I think all of these are also necessary. And then finally, I think when it comes to the external sector, I do think that China's exports will remain resilient. And I also agree very much with Dr. Liu that China needs to have more role in global governance, which I think China has been doing and has been doing quite successfully, in the sense it's not only trying to reform some of these legacy institutions from within, right, WTO or IMF, and urge the reforms, but also build alternative financial institutions around. So the NDBs, AIIBs, and so on and so forth. So I think there is definitely important role for China to play in that regard.
And on that note, we've come to the end of this session. Many thanks to Professor Yan Liang from the Willamette University in the United States, Professor Liu Baocheng of the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing, and Dr. Zhou Mi with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation for your time and insights. Please tell us your thoughts on this topic and the show. Send us a line at radio@cgtn.com. I'm Tune. Thank you for listening. See you next time.
I cannot marry you while your mother regards me.
Step into the world of timeless elegance with Mrs. Spring Fragrance, a captivating audiobook by Edith Eaton, read by Man Ling.
Because the green leaf still clings to the bough.
Experience the lively yet complex lives in Chinese American communities at the turn of the 20th century, as Edith Eaton's delicate prose weaves together themes of tradition, change, love, and identity.
Forget all that belongs to the joy of life.
Follow the journey of Mrs. Spring Fragrance and witness the struggles and fights of those living on a rapidly changing exotic land while holding on to their cultural traditions, or more importantly, to their
He
identities.
could hardly believe that his daughter was seriously opposed to becoming the wife of such a good-looking, prosperous young merchant as Wang Ling.
Join Books and Beyond for Mrs. Spring Fragrance. Let the stories come to life in your imagination. Subscribe to Books and Beyond for free on your favorite podcast platforms or log on to radio.cgtn.com for more.